Sorry for the late start. Thank you all for coming. Should be a very good evening of discussion. We have two very esteemed guest speakers tonight, coming both from the Seanad, and our brilliant student speakers, of course, as usual. Now, the topic of debate tonight is the Catholic Church, with the motion being this House believes that the Catholic Church is a force for good. Of course, it's a very broad topic. We would like to keep everyone in a calm mood for this evening. And for that reason, we will not be having points of information, but there will be a Q&A at the end where you can ask any amount of questions to any of our speakers, as long as you keep it concise and relevant to the topic. So the Catholic Church traces its roots to the early Christianity of Jesus Christ and his apostles, namely Peter, who is regarded as the first pope. Early Christians were heavily persecuted up until 313, when the Edict of Milan legalized Christianity, and it therefore spread to Europe. In 432, St. Patrick brought Christianity to Ireland, and look what we still have today. In 476, when the Roman Empire fell, this led to a vacuum of institutions within Europe and led to a greater rise in the church. Monasteries developed greatly in Ireland, although they did come under threat in the 8th and 9th centuries from Viking raids. The first Great Schism of 1054 happened when the Eastern Orthodox Church split from the Catholic Church for reasons of theological differences. Following this, there came the Crusades, where the Church endorsed a series of crusades to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. The 1500s were a very eventful time for the Church due to the rise of the Anglican Church under King Henry VIII and the Reformation under Martin Luther. This led to further splits and orders, leading to incidents such as the 30 Years' War, and in Ireland we had Cromwell and the plantation policies brutally repressing Catholicism in Ireland. The Enlightenment also brought further challenges to the Church's control over Europe, such as the French Revolution, which caused great seizure of church property and suppression of religious orders. Ireland, meanwhile, enforced the famous penal laws, which were passed strictly to restrict the lives of Irish Catholics, barring them from certain professions, education, or land ownership. The Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829 under Daniel O'Connell led to a regaining of some of these civil rights. Globally at this time as well, Catholic missionary work spread, providing education and health. Upon the Free State being formed in 1922 in Ireland, the Catholic Church was elevated as a status within Irish society, being given a special relevance in the Constitution of 1937. The Second Vatican Council of 1965 brought widespread reforms, such as Mass began to be said in the vernacular language rather than in Latin, and the giving of the Eucharist was also changed. However, since the 1970s, Irish and Western society has seen a mass secularization, and the liberal agenda has come about via contraception, divorce, same-sex marriage, abortion, and the Church began to allow it to appear fallible in the media as well, in films like Life of Brian or series such as Father Ted. Since the 90s, unfortunately, there have been widespread revelations of global sexual and physical abuse. This has rocked public trust in the institution and has caused outrage worldwide. As of today, the Church is no longer considered a major power in society, but it is still one of the largest institutions of spirituality worldwide and brings a lot of meaning to millions of people. So with that said, I will allow the proposition to take over. Our first speaker of the proposition tonight is Senator Rónán Mullen. Senator Rónán Mullen hails from Galway, and he did a Masters of Journalism in this very college. He has been qualified as a teacher. He also wrote as a columnist for the Irish Catholic, and also qualified as a barrister. He has been first elected to the Seanad in 2007 and has been known for his conservative stances on social policy, campaigning against numerous referendums in recent years, such as the abortion referendum in 2018 or the family and care referendum in March of this year. He is also a strong critic of the recently dumped hate speech bill, and I would like to welcome him now to the stage to give his side of the proposition.
Well, thank you very good evening, everybody, and thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Jamie, for that very kind introduction and very impressive summary, if I may say so, of 2,000 years of Catholic history, if not Christian history. You know you're getting old when the lecture theatre you're speaking in is named after somebody whose funeral you attended, as I did back in 1996, I think it was the time when I was working actually for the Dublin Archdiocese. I attended Veronica's funeral. May she rest in peace. It's a pleasure to speak here this evening, and it's also an honour to be invited to meet you again. I've been here before, always very enjoyable. But also it matters to me personally to be asked to speak on a very important topic like this is. In a way, I'm not here speaking as a politician because, though a very flawed person in many ways, I'm sure those who know me, including my distinguished Shannon colleague, could enumerate some of those flaws. But faith matters to me personally. It is a gift in my life. It has brought great joy to my life. And thinking of Evelyn Waugh, the famous English writer, you may have read Brideshead Revisited or seen the movie. He was rather an obnoxious character, but somebody once said to him, Mr. Waugh, you're obnoxious, and yet you claim to be a Catholic. You are a Catholic. He said, Madam, I can assure you I'd be a great deal worse if I were not a Catholic. And I sometimes think that might sum up myself as well. But if I were to speak about this topic in purely political terms, and as a politician I must communicate ideas that make sense to people of goodwill of all faiths and none, and there's no point in me making arguments that people who don't share my faith or spiritual outlook on life, that it can't make sense to them. So as a politician I try to speak to the common good, which I think can unite people of goodwill of all faiths and none. But if we're speaking about this in purely political terms on the one hand, on the other, conflictual terms if you'd like, I would have to start by acknowledging the horror of child sexual abuse perpetrated by, admittedly, a small number of priests and religious who nonetheless did huge damage, not least because of what they stood for, that they had access to children because of their position in society, and indeed the trust people had in them because they were people of the church, of which so much was rightly expected. And I'd also mention the dreadful failure of religious figures who had authority over these, mainly men, to realise that these acts were not just sins, which was always understood, of course, but crimes, and that these perpetrators should have been removed from their positions and reported to the Gardaí if, where and once there was any awareness of such crimes. I could mention also the Church's challenging teachings, which divide and challenge people sometimes. I could mention the religious divisions between people that have somehow, maybe not some, well, yes, in Ireland to some degree in the north, but perhaps even more dramatically internationally, where people's religious divisions have become, and they have allowed them to become, a motivation for violent acts towards other people, in direct contradiction almost, you would have to say, to the loving message that's at the heart of the gospel. And then I would contrast as a politician that terrible legacy, particularly from the late 20th century, with all the good that people of faith, including those in the Catholic Church, have done for centuries before that, when the Irish people were beaten down by a foreign oppressor. Because for centuries it was the priests who stood with the people, priests who came from Irish families and went to Rome, Louvain, Salamanca, Lisbon, Prague, dozens of other places. Priests who knew that they were coming back to persecution and sometimes torture and death. Think of St. Oliver Plunkett, who was hanged, drawn and quartered in 1681, a couple of decades after Cromwell's brutal reign of terror into Ireland. A man who loved his neighbour because he loved his God, and who came back to be a leader of faith, knowing what it could and eventually did lead to. And that terrible era is recorded in folklore too. Some of you may have learned what I learned in my school days, although there's a gap of some decades between our school days, a poem on Shohillar Glana by Sean McEoirish, which is about an old man, Brian O'Lea, attending Catholic Mass being celebrated by a hunted priest for a stricken people in an isolated place. And the British soldiers approach on horseback, and it's too late for the priest to escape. And the old man urges the priest, a young man, to change clothes with him. And Father Sean escapes, and as they say in the poem, as the poet wrote, the chruchshid Brian chran caelord demig seir an sagart. Brian was hanged on a tall, thin tree. The young priest escaped. And you know, those kind of stories go into folklore because they reflect a reality of the trust and the dependence that people had on their faith and on the church when there was nobody else to stand up for them. I think of the 19th century when Daniel O'Connell was fighting for Catholic emancipation and later indeed for repeal of the Act of Union. It was the temperance movement founded by Father Matthew which gave so much power to O'Connell's mass movement, because drunkenness had been a huge problem among the impoverished and oppressed Irish. And Father Matthew's mass movement, again born out of a love of God and a love of neighbour, did so much to lift up the people. In the 20th century, it was a Catholic layman, Frank Duff, perhaps one of the greatest Irishmen, who founded an organisation that grew to have millions of people worldwide, the Legion of Mary. And it was Frank and that legion which set an example for church and state alike in their compassionate and enlightenment support for young single mothers in the early 20th century, who were often separated from their children because of poverty and lack of family support, but which the Legion, in its very enlightened view, worked to keep together and with all sorts of imaginative schemes to get them out to work and minding their kids during the day and so on, at a time when there was nothing in Ireland. Because the truth is that the church, trying to love Christ in the least of his brothers and sisters, and with all its flaws, built schools and hospitals, organised hospitals, as it has done for centuries in other places, when there was no state to pay for these, and later indeed when the state had no money to pay for it. And all of this happened not because the church was trying to kind of create a job for itself as some kind of an elaborate NGO, but because there was a sense of duty and responsibility to Christ and to humanity made in his image. And the scandal and the tragedy is that the church, which stood and stands for so much, should have lost its way, particularly for a number of decades, in securing the safety for the least of us and the most vulnerable among us. Now, all of that analysis might or might not persuade you, and I could say, look, the church is one of the few organisations left which dares to stand up for what it believes to be true, even when it's unpopular in society, and that itself should make us think. Or I could talk about, yes, sectarianism, differences of religion, and yet it was the church perhaps preeminently working for peace in the north. You think of people like Father Alec Reid and the Redemptorists and others, and other Protestant leaders drawing the terrorist leaders to places that were secure and safe where people could talk, and which eventually led to the peace process. So when we think about the church in Ireland, to borrow a book that's very interesting by Derek Scally, the journalist, The Best Catholics in the World, we need to think that the church's challenges and achievements and failures are very much an Irish story, but they are also an international story. Just as abuse is not just a church problem, sadly, it is an Irish problem. And it has been an international problem in schools run just by the secular state. They have had their horrors too. Doesn't minimize it, because as I said, the church stands for so much. It must set the standard, but it is important that we try and understand things in their fullness. But whether or not all of that would persuade you that the church has been vastly more a source of good than evil, I think that anyone who ever saw a priest ministering to a dying person in a hospital, or to the victim of a road traffic accident, or comforting the bereaved, or reconciling a person with the possibility of happiness where they've lost their way in life in every other way, or a lay person I know who, inspired by the gospel, gives her life and is still giving it to abandoned children with disabilities in a horribly difficult country right now, which is Haiti. You know, these heroes are a part of the church's history. They're also a part of the church's present, and they will be a part of the church's future. And they don't just exist in the church. They exist in other religions. They exist among virtuous atheists and agnostics. But there is something about the gospel and that idea that we are loved by a God who created us, that we are special in that God's eyes, that releases energy to love your neighbour, which I truly believe that. And I think that if one had the joy of knowing such people, one would perhaps realise a bit more than we do in today's society the beauty of Christianity and what it can be for those who encounter it, whether in the form of a bishop, a priest, a religious sister, or just an ordinary lay believer trying to follow Jesus Christ, particularly in the least of his brethren. But none of that is the most important thing, because in the end, the church is not some kind of centralised, or to be honest about it, very decentralised NGO. Even if a quarter of the hospitals in Africa are founded and run by the church, or whatever other statistic I could offer you, it's better this evening that I speak to you as I said, a very limited in my approach, but as a sincere, at least, follower of Jesus Christ, who believes, as I do, in the church, as the organization founded by Christ, to be his hands, eyes and ears and tongue to spread the good news that our sins are forgiven, that we are not mere chemicals, that we have a life that is even greater than this life on earth, and that our eternal destiny is joy with our Creator if we freely choose it. And it's not, in a way, the church, and I am very near the finish, so thank you for your toleration. In a way here tonight, friends, it's not the church you must first decide about. It's Jesus Christ and how you feel about who Christ is and what he is. Because the church is the organization, whether one likes it or not, that Christ established. That's what our Catholic Church, as those of us who are Catholics understand it. Others are Protestants, and I know there are many people of good faith, other religions and good faith. But the church, membership of the church, is about a life's journey, really, into the love of Christ, believing that our life has a higher meaning and purpose. That Christ chose to die for my sins is hard to understand, but I certainly know I have sins, and the idea that I'm loved infinitely releases me to try and be a more loving person myself. I only think I understand why Christ's death was necessary. I don't claim to understand the great mysteries. That's why they're called mysteries. I think of it like the pain that a parent willingly undergoes, the sacrifice they willingly make for the child they love, even if the child doesn't appreciate it. But if that's hard to understand, then here's something even harder. If Christ didn't rise from the dead, as St. Paul says, and if Christ not be risen, as 1 Corinthians says, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is all in vain. So in other words, if there wasn't a resurrection, I am talking nonsense here tonight, and I don't really deserve your attention, even if, maybe I deserve your attention and respect, but I cannot possibly be persuasive. Because faith in a loving God is all about offering hope in the face of horror. The horrors we know in our world that we cannot fully solve in this world, but that Jesus Christ is the fullest expression of God's love for us, even in our most extreme pain. Sweet Christ, who fell so far that all who fall into him. Finally, today is the 2nd of October, the Feast of the Guardian Angels. In my belief, and in some of yours, we all have one of them. If you ever know fear or dread, or if you just want to get your day off to a good start, try this formula. O angel of God, my guardian dear, to whom God's love commits me here, ever this day be at my side, to light and guard, to rule and guide. Amen. Or to quote Numbers, the King James Version, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he bless you and make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you and lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace, so that you will forgive me for going on too long. Thank you very much.
So, with that, I would like to thank Senator Mullen for his restraint. I would like to welcome our first speaker of the opposition for the night. Her name is Senator Annie Hoey. She hails from the Labour Party. Senator Hoey was born in Drogheda before studying in UCC in Cork. There she was the chair of FEMSOC and the LGBT Society. She went on to become a president of the USI. In 2018, she was involved in both the re-election campaign of Michael D. Higgins and the campaign to repeal the 8th Amendment. Having been elected in the local elections of 2019, Senator Hoey was elected to the Seanad in 2020 and has been seen as an advocate for very socially liberal policies since her arrival there. So with that, I would like you all to welcome Senator Annie Hoey.
So thank you all very much for having me here this evening on what is certainly a very straightforward, not in any way emotive topic, that the Catholic Church is a force for good. So for the sake of brevity, I might just consider briefly what exactly good means within the context of Christianity, and presumably by default the Catholic Church. We could do good in many, many different ways, but we'll just try and keep this narrow for this concise topic. So from a Christian perspective, I suppose good is rooted in following God's will and embodying virtues like love, justice, and compassion. The Bible states, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good," Romans 12:21. emphasizing moral conduct aligned with divine guidance. Jesus teaches that the greatest commandments as loving God and loving others, Matthew's 22:37-40, highlighting love as central to goodness. St. Augustine defines good as that which in accordance with God's nature, stating, God is the highest good and our true good is to be found in him. Thomas Aquinas, I really did my research on these people. Thomas Aquinas further explains that the good of the creature consists in the fulfillment of its nature, which for humans is to act in accordance with reason and God's law. So in this view, good reflects obedience to God, promoting human flourishing, the greater good of all creation. So I suppose in Christianity, good might involve actions that reflect the love and compassion of God, such as charity, forgiveness, and humility. Which brings us to the question, is the Catholic Church a force for good? And we've already reflected on what the Bible itself or other Christian scholars define as good. So let's see whether the Catholic Church itself upholds these ideals. And to be very clear, I'm speaking about the institution of the Catholic Church, not individuals who have faith or any other belief system. So let's consider the role of the Catholic Church in a global context, whether that could be considered good, and then a little bit closer to home as to whether the Catholic Church has been a force for good here in Ireland. So when you think of the global context, I suppose the assertion that the Catholic Church is a force for good could be maybe highly contentious when you examine it through a historical lens. Over the past 1,000 years, the Catholic Church has been implicated in numerous incidents of abuse, corruption, repression that challenge the notion of its moral authority. One of the most significant examples in the Church's role is the Crusades and the Inquisitions. These violent campaigns, often justified under religious mandates, result in the deaths of countless individuals, persecution of those who held different beliefs, including Jews, Muslims, and the so-called heretics. And the Church used its power to impose its doctrines through brutality, contributing to literally centuries of religious conflict and tolerance. So I doubt anyone tormented under the piety of the Crusades would have considered the Catholic Church to be a force for good. If we talk about colonialism, the Catholic Church played a role in supporting European imperialism, especially in Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia. Missionaries often accompanied colonizing forces, facilitating the suppression of indigenous cultures, languages, and spiritual practices. And many indigenous populations throughout the world were subjected to forced conversions, exploitation, while their traditional ways of life were dismantled under the guise of religious salvation. Native Americans and Canadians were forced into industrial schools, severed from their traditions and ancestry, and the impact of those are still being felt today. More recently, the Church has faced global scandals involving sexual abuse of children, which I think, quite frankly, have tarnished its moral credibility. From the US all the way to Australia, systemic abuse and cover-ups have devastated lives and communities. And the Church's response has often been one of denial or protection of its clergy, further deepening mistrust. So while the Church has undeniably, globally contributed to education, healthcare, and charity, I would say the history of violence, repression, and abuse significantly undermines the claim that it is force for good globally. But let's look a little bit closer to home here in Ireland. The assertion that the Catholic Church is a force for good in Ireland is one that I would invite you to offer some critical reflection on, especially given the historical and social context of the past century. So we'll keep it nice and tight, just 100 years to whiz through. So while the Church undoubtedly has played a significant role in shaping Irish society, its influence has often been deeply problematic, marked by systemic abuses of power, cover-up, and suppressions of rights. I think one of the most damning aspects of the Catholic Church's role in Ireland has been its involvement in the abuse and mistreatment of vulnerable populations, particularly children and women. The scandals surrounding clerical sexual abuse have profoundly shaken Irish society, and for decades, the Church not only failed to protect children from sexual predators within its ranks, but also systemically covered up cases of abuse. Priests who were accused of abuse were often moved from parish to parish rather than being held accountable, enabling further harm. And the Church's protection of these abusers, in my opinion, is a profound betrayal of the trust and has left a lasting scar on Ireland's collective consciousness. And I recognise that those who were perpetrating this abuse may have been in a minority, but the cover-up went all the way right up to the top. Beyond sexual abuse, the Catholic Church was central to the operation of institutions like the Magdalene Laundries, where women and girls, many of whom were unmarried mothers, were subjected to forced labour under brutal conditions. The Church justified this mistreatment, and I will acknowledge that the state was hand in hand with this, justified this mistreatment under the guise of moral correction, labelling these women as fallen or morally corrupt. The true extent of the physical and psychological abuse in these institutions is only coming to light in recent decades. And I hazard that we may never actually truly know the horrific impact those cover-ups, those abusement and those mistreatment of those women and children, I don't think we're ever going to fully know the impact that has had on those people. We'll never reveal the full horrifying story of neglect, exploitation and systemic dehumanisation. And the survivors of these institutions were often stigmatised and silenced for much of their lives, with the church and state being complicit in this cover-up. And I've worked with many people, women who were put through these institutions or were children of put through those institutions, and the never-ending horror and pain that they feel and the anguish that they feel because the church is not, as they feel, engaging as fully in the redress scheme. And obviously we know what the government has done itself with damaging records, and I don't think the government of the day have stepped up to this either. The Catholic Church's overwhelming influence in Irish politics and society in the 20th century has also contributed to a stifling of individual freedoms. I would say its grip on matters of morality, sexuality and education resulted in repressive social order that curtailed personal autonomy, particularly for women. Until relatively recent, I would say that Ireland had some of the most restrictive laws on things like contraception, divorce, abortion in Europe, and that is largely because of the Church's powerful influence. The Church's moral authority dictated what was acceptable, creating an atmosphere where issues like reproductive rights and LGBTQ rights were taboo, leaving many individuals and families suffering in silence. Some of the things that the Catholic Church opposed in Ireland: tampons, the mother and child healthcare scheme, studying in Trinity College, married women in the civil service, contraception, divorce, decriminalisation of homosexuality, sexuality, divorce again, partnerships, equal marriage, access to abortion. So in 1944, the Catholic Church in Ireland opposes the use of tampons. Archbishop John McQuaid expressed to the Secretary of the Department of Health his disapproval concerning the use of tampons, particularly by unmarried persons. In 1970, the Catholic Church lifts its ban on attending Trinity College. The ban was issued under Lenten regulations issued by the Dublin Archbishop. It stated any Catholic who disobeys the law is guilty of mortal sin, and while he persists in disobedience is unworthy to receive the sacraments. So I'm sure there's some people here would agree that attending Trinity is indeed a mortal sin to this day, but I think perhaps we can recognise that that was a little too far. Moreover, the Church's control over education meant that it not only dictated the content of the curriculum, but exerted influence over values taught to generations of children, and it further entrenched its power and perpetuated moral conservatism. And we recognise that's still happening today. The Church's opposition to secularism in education, with many schools still under Church control today, even though Ireland has become a much more pluralistic society. So while it's true that the Catholic Church has provided charitable works and fostered a sense of community, and in my opinion, these positive contributions are overshadowed by the harm it has caused. Its role in shaping Irish society has been deeply entwined with oppression, abuse and control, undermining the notion that it has been purely a positive force or a force for good. In modern Ireland, the Church's declining influence reflects a society reckoning with its painful past and seeking a more just and equitable future. Everything, of course, has to be taken on balance. None of the above actions or horrific incidents I've outlined this evening, both in Ireland and globally, preclude the fact that there are many people who work and operate within the structures of the Catholic Church who live lives true to their Christian calling and operate with humility, love and seek to do good. But the statements I've made also do not preclude the fact that the Catholic Church has and continue provides care, shelter, sustenance and guidance to many millions of people. But we have to consider the question in front of us in the round, all things weighed up and considered. If we say, yes, all those terrible things happened under its watch, but ultimately it's an overall force for good, then I have to ask you, how many lives, how many souls, how many individuals, how many families must it hurt, torment, and a whole plethora of things before the scales flip from being a good to not good? How many little children must be stuffed in a septic tank before we go, actually, I know that was too many. It's no longer a force for good. How many times can the redress to poor women be refused before we say, actually, do you know what? You're no longer a force for good. And I'm not talking about things in the past that seem almost silly today, opposing tampons and admonishing those who go to Trinity. I'm talking about deeply egregious, cruel and unfathomable actions that I simply do not believe are compatible with Jesus' teaching and the greatest commandment that loving God and loving others. There is no love or goodness in even one little child being sexually abused by a priest. There is no love or goodness in even one woman being locked up in a laundry and the order still refusing to pay redress to her. So I would say in conclusion, from an Irish perspective, the Catholic Church's legacy over the past 100 years cannot be described as a force for good. Its involvement in institutional abuse, suppression of personal freedoms, and its moral authoritarianism has left an indelible mark on Irish society, many of which are still being addressed today. To overlook these aspects is to ignore the suffering of countless individuals who are betrayed by an institution that claimed to act in their best interests, and in my mind, it would overlook them in the name of declaring all the other bits and pieces that the Catholic Church did as being a force for good, and to me that goes against the very teachings of Christianity about love and goodness. So when we consider the deeds that have been done in the name of the Catholic Church and the harms the Catholic Church continue to perpetuate around the world, then we cannot, in good faith, say that the Catholic Church is ultimately a force for good.
Thank you very much to Senator Hoey for that contribution. With that said, I would like to welcome our first student speaker of the evening, coming from the proposition side. Would you all please welcome Jakob Falcioni.
Hello everyone. We've come today to talk about the Catholic Church, an institution as old as time itself. And I don't want to beat around the bush. The Catholic Church has done some horrible things. Thank you, Senator Eileen, for coming today and also for enlisting these horrible things. And I agree that these are not permissible and these shouldn't be accepted. But I think we should also look at the broader picture. Not only look at the Church's faults, but also at the good things it's doing. First of all, I would like to look at the historian aspect that Senator Eileen brought up, like the Crusades or imperialism. I have to say I find that point not really applicable, because if you look at any institution's history and go that far back, the things you'd find are just horrendous in every sense for today's morals. But back in the day, the times just were different. So I don't know if picking out the Catholic Church is a productive thought. Other than that, as I said, horrendous things have been done. But these were all done by individuals. And I don't think it's right to demonize a whole institution with a tradition this long just for the bad deeds of a few people. It's like saying there's doctors all over the world and every day they make fatal mistakes, but I don't stop going to the doctor, because in the end, I think the positive side largely outweighs the negative side. And in my opinion, it's a similar discussion with the Catholic Church. Also, I would like to focus on one particular shortcoming on equal marriage. I agree that it's unacceptable, again, that this is not tolerated by the Catholic Church. But we have to keep in mind that the Catholic Church is a global institution. We are talking 1.3 billion members all around the world. And now, I know we Westerners really like to do that, to force our values onto others and play the enlightened people. But the truth is that in other countries, they just don't share our beliefs. And just to bring that into perspective, even in Ireland, until 2015, gay marriages weren't allowed. So I think it's a bit dubious to expect an institution as big as the Catholic Church to just put forth our values and impose them on others, even though in other parts of the world, the countries still have to go through this development and come hopefully to the same conclusion as we did. Last, I would say that the Church is also at the forefront at confronting these scandals. I mean, with Pope Francis, we have probably one of the most liberal popes there's ever been. He himself is pushing for changes in how we handle misconduct. And I know we can't ignore the flaws, but I don't think we shouldn't let them define the whole institution, as the Catholic Church, for many people, still is a beacon of hope. But what are actually the good things that the Catholic Church is doing well? Which I think is something we don't speak enough of. For example, they built over 220,000 schools all around the world and are educating 61 million students per year. I mean, if we stacked all those schools, we could probably almost reach the heavens. Not quite, but And these schools are in poor countries. They provide education to students that otherwise wouldn't have anything remotely comparable. Also, the Catholic Church operates more than 20,000 healthcare facilities. So, without exaggerating, I can say that the church is saving lives every day. And again, these hospitals are in places where the people otherwise wouldn't have any access to medical care comparable to that. Last, the Catholic Church is also a massive provider for social services. They operate orphanages, they have care homes, the Caritas helps with disaster relief and fights poverty. So what I'm trying to say is that the Catholic Church isn't just preaching, they actually roll up their sleeves and do something and try to make the world a better place and to put their beliefs in action. At last, I would like to look at how the Catholic Church shaped our society and our communities. Think about all the big families events you've attended. I'm sure some of them, or even most of them, were christenings, communions, marriages, and even funerals. The church accompanies us throughout our lives. And for many old peoples, at the end of their lives, the family is the only, the Catholic Church is the only place they can go to feel a sense of community and to escape loneliness. Also, the Catholic Church has shaped the fabric of the Western society. I'm sure we have many law students that in the room, as usual, and they should know that the beliefs of the Catholic Church shape the way our law is structured in a major way. Same goes for our philosophies and our ethics. Then again, another thing we take granted is our human rights and dignity. Both trace back to the Catholic beliefs and were talked about in the Catholic Church long before it was a fashionable topic in politics. So, all in all, I would like to say that although the Catholic Church has made some major mistakes, I think we shouldn't demonize the whole institution, and everybody should have a bit of a more differentiated look on things and maybe think about all the positive things that the Catholic Church is also doing and not just focus on a few scandals that have been, to some extent, blown out of proportion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jakob, for that. With that said, I would like to invite our first opposition student speaker of the night to come up. Would you all please welcome Sean Burke.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honour to be able to speak to you all today in the presence of such a well-spoken panel, and on a topic which I personally hold much investment and intrigue in. Having grown up and being educated in a Catholic school with a fairly religious mother, but while having a father who somewhat sat silently by with regards to my religious journey, has left me in a peculiar position. My mother to me represented belief. And just as an aside now, standing in opposition to the Catholic Church today, I want to make it clear that it is not these believers, such as Senator Mullen himself, that we are standing in opposition to. It would be foolish to reprimand individual members of the Church for placing their faith wherever they wish to place it. They are welcome to their faith, and to the fulfillment they receive from it. What we stand against is the institution of the church. So that being said, my mother represented religious belief in my life. However, my father, his silence when it came to religion, gave off this impression to a younger me that there was something much more sinister going on with the church. His silence represented something nefarious, that which a child should not be exposed to. As I grew older, I inevitably learnt what this silence represented: feelings of distrust, feelings of anger, feelings of betrayal, feelings of disgust and hurt and fear. For him, as a child that grew up in the 60s and 70s, all of these feelings directed at the institution of the church were so very real. And so, in speaking today, I'm going to set out why it is that these overwhelming feelings festered. I'm going to set out what exactly it is that the church has done to cause this much harm, and why no amount of ill-placed good spoken of by proposition today can ever outweigh the catastrophic damage left in the church's wake. I'd like to go over some of the points that have already been mentioned in regard to Ireland itself. I'd like to address the rumblings from the proposition of the transitional harms done by the church, particularly in this country. I feel we should not afford the church such a generously light overview of these events. Rape, sexual violence, physical violence, illegal adoptions, forced labor, and arbitrary detention. Young Irish women were subjected to all of this relentlessly through the Magdalene laundries and mother and baby homes. It has been estimated that at minimum 14,000 women and girls were confined within Magdalene laundries. At minimum 56,000 unmarried mothers and 57,000 children were confined to mother and baby homes. And at a minimum 9,000 of these children died. That's 19%. Their bodies largely discarded into mass graves, such as one located in Tuam, County Galway. These religious institutions actively facilitated the discarding and disregard of women who had been engaged in premarital relations. When tossed aside by their families and with nowhere else to go, what better way to treat them than to hours of unpaid labor and horrendous levels of abuse? Oh, and I did not remind you where that underlying attitude ingrained in Irish society came from in the first place. But we need not look that far back to see the effects of institutional harm caused by the church. I'd like to tell you all a brief story of Darren McCavan. When Darren was 7, his abuser, Tony Walsh, became a priest in their local parish in Ballyfermot. Tony Walsh was a man of the community. He had a deadly Elvis impression. He travelled the country and was paid to perform. Everyone in the parish thought he was amazing. But he knew a dirty little secret about the McCavan family. He knew Darren's father was an abuser. Darren's father bet his mother, and he bet Darren. Tony Walsh came to Darren's mother, telling her, "Look, you have damaged this child. Let me take him out. Let me bring him to the church. Let me show him love." And of course, this idea sounded amazing to Darren's mother. Give her child a second chance in the church, take him away from the abuse he suffered from at home. But how could she have known that she was just sending him to be subject to even more abuse? She could never have known that he would be tied down over a coffee table, the room lit with a thin burning candle, and she could never have known that he would be raped repeatedly by that same burning candle. A study done by Spotlight in Boston estimated that 6% of priests are, like Tony Walsh, pedophiles, and that each would abuse 250 victims in their lifetime. If we apply that to Ireland, that gives us around 70,000 boys who were raped, assaulted, tortured, and many of which who did not survive like Darren, but were taken by suicide. Now, why bring up these incidents? They're isolated, as Jakob mentioned earlier. Oh, small cases, one-off. But of course, the church would have stopped this behavior if they knew what was going on. But see, that's precisely the problem. The response from the church on these issues has been abhorrent. The Pope's first public apology for the atrocities committed by priests in the Irish Catholic Church was when he visited Ireland in 2018. And let's clarify, part of that apology was for the cover-up itself, following this discovery of cases of pedophilia. He said he is keeping bishops accountable by removing them, but that is not good enough. These bishops are being allowed to resign and walk away, unaccountable. Popes and bishops have said that they did not know. Once again, that's problematic. They did know, they lied about it. If we look internationally, I think it's important to do so. AIDS, we can all agree, is bad. But to borrow from Christopher Hitchens, the church seems to think that it's not as bad or as immoral in the same way as condoms. While millions in Africa continue to suffer misery from the AIDS crisis, the Catholic Church stood by in its stance on contraception, discouraging its use, which scientifically and undeniably reduces the chances of contracting the disease. I'd like to briefly touch on the amount of wealth in the church as well, which has been mentioned by Jakob, and it's being used for good, yes. But what good is using such a small portion of that wealth? The amount of wealth that sits in the Vatican in 2019 was estimated to have net assets of 4 billion. So much wealth sits idly by. Not enough is done with it. And with all these humanitarian endeavors that have been mentioned, and have said to be done with nothing more than a will to provide aid, there is in fact a resounding absence of the admission that these acts were done with the hope to proselytize. All right, I could really go on and on, folks. I have more notes here, but it would be impossible to synopsize all of these horrendous acts that the church has enabled in its 2,000-year reign in a short 7-minute speech. What I want to leave you with is this. Proposition will continue to speak of acts of good done by the church, but it is just not possible for any institution to be called a continuing force of good when in each and every one of those acts, countless people have been left suffering, raped, tortured, scared for their lives. It is for these reasons that we staunchly oppose this evening's motion. Thank you for your time.
I'd like to thank Sean very much for that. With that said, I'd like to welcome the final speaker from the proposition for the night. Would you all please welcome Sean O. Kane.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me bring you back to the 25th of March 443, the birthplace of the Catholic Church in Ireland. 1,581 years of Irish nationalism, Irish culture, and the success of the Irish state. Yet the opposition wants to discredit this based on the scandals of the church in the 20th century. Imagine discrediting an entire institution based off half a century of mistakes. You hardly call the German state a force for evil because of the atrocities they committed. Let's get into what the church has done for us. Since the church's modest monastic beginnings, it has been a centre of education and protection for the Irish people, providing refuge against pillaging Vikings, being renowned across Europe for their scholarship and libraries. Even during the famine, one of the most traumatic times for the Irish people, it killed 1 million people. It led to 1.5 million people emigrating. They provided financial assistance where they could. They lobbied for rights. Priests legitimately risked their lives to help the sick. Can you not see the plague of narrow-mindedness the opposition has to ignore all of these heroic patriotic acts? And now to where the church really made a difference. In 1922, the Irish Free State was formed. It was a vacuum, nobody to run the social services, the healthcare, the education system. The period right after a new stage is formed is always one of uncertainty, of conflict, of chaos. But the church, as has done throughout its entire history, took the responsibility and ran these basic but essential services in Ireland. Things like managing schools, raising funds, working without pay. In an uncertain time, they provided us stability. Even to this day, they run 90% of our primary schools and 50% of our secondary schools. But have we really turned out that bad? The moral framework they have taught us, has that made us bad people? It has given us a foundation for which we have prospered under. The Catholic Church has been with us every step of the way, from its inception to the modern day. And now let's get into its being intertwined with the Irish identity. The 17th century penal laws severely suppressed the rights of Irish Catholics and led to becoming a marker of Irish identity, being associated with resistance against the oppression we would face against the British. It banned us from owning land, from voting, from going to certain schools, for God's sake. And let me tell you a name, Daniel O'Connell, a devout Catholic, an Irish nationalist who attempted to get Irish and Catholic emancipation and equality, to undo the penal laws. In 1829, with the help of a crucial Catholic financial and social foundation, the Catholic Emancipation Act was passed. This was the first time in centuries that the Irish Catholic could sit in government, could vote. Do you not see how vital this was? Throughout this period, they kept the Gaelic culture going. They created the very GA clubs we play in today. They built and maintained communities. The church isn't just a building in a town in the centre. It's the foundation of a community. They consistently supported movements for home rule, up until the Easter Rising, where devout Catholics, Padraig Pearse, James Connolly, Eamon de Valera, they were influential in the turning point for the Irish nation. While the church initially condemned the violence, after the horrific executions in 1916, they changed their stance, and this sympathy for the cause, while not being the only factor, led to a large momentum increase and a final push for Irish independence from British rule. Lastly, let me explain the importance of the moral framework they created, and which we to this day live by. Faith, love, truth, community, forgiveness. These are just some of the core values of the church, which we were all brought up to abide by. Here are 3 Irish examples of thousands and thousands of stories of people whose lives have been changed by the church. Meet Laura. Our lives and our marriage were a mess. We'd moved to a new town where we had no friends. We were in debt. My mom had died a year before. My husband travelled 5 days a week and worked the other 2. I had a stage 4 chronic illness, and there was not much chance of me getting kids. We were in a crisis. I needed a miracle, a way out. My only option was the church. I began praying every morning, every evening. I attended Mass. I believed. After one of the Masses was over, a priest stepped forward and said, "Whoever needs healing, pray for right now. God wants to heal you." Immediately, I was washed in a dazzling white light. My surroundings simply faded away, and my mind's eye saw myself holding a baby. 8 months later, I had a baby, and my mum recovered from her illness. Now, meet Kieran. I got arrested for dealing drugs. I was sentenced to prison for 2 years and 9 months for possession with intent to supply. I'd been involved with stuff like that before. While I was inside, I attended chapel services on Sunday. A priest inside told me, "You can choose either to be a person who is in prison, or you can choose to be a prisoner." That hit the nail on the head for me and made me realize I had to turn my life around. While I was in prison, I used the Angel Tree Present Giving Scheme run by the prison church to send a gift to my daughter. When I got out of prison, I saw the present my daughter had, together with a personal note. I became a son of the church and now live happily with my daughter, whom I thought I would lose forever. Meet Brian. Through a series of horrible things that I went through, I found myself wanting to commit suicide. Things were looking bad for me, bad enough to choose death instead of life. I never had an affinity with the church, but I still went. Now, a set of elders in their 90s, at the end of service, they said, "Line up if you want special prayers." So I did. When I got to the front, for some reason, the elderly sitting man got up and said, "I want to pray with you for this one." It was something I had never experienced in my life. I felt like something was pouring over my head. That was giving me the chills all over my body. It was phenomenal. When I went to bed that night, I began to pray. This pouring out was such a liberating feeling. I felt like a new person. I had been changed. The 1920s to 1970s was undoubtedly a period where the church did more harm than good, leaving people to be traumatized for the rest of their lives. But thinking this period undoes all the good the Catholic Church has and continues to do in Ireland is a gross and unfair distortion of our history and the role the Catholic Church has played in helping us gain and remain independent against the constant attempts of the British to evangelize the Irish nation. Is this how we remember the selfless men and women who stood by us, provided for us in our darkest moments? Is this how we treat people who gave us our very own mental code? We should be proud. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Sean, for that. With that said, I would like to welcome the final speaker of the night, coming from the opposition. Would you all please welcome Jamie O'Connor.
It's undeniable that the Catholic Church is an integral part of European culture and Irish culture and always will be. I am someone who considers God a large part of my life, as over the summer I rekindled my faith and looked into the meaning of God and see how it could improve my mindset. And since I have mentally, physically and spiritually been at the best point of my own life. So some of you may ask, why don't I believe the Catholic Church is a force for good? There are many reasons I possess this belief. I believe that the Catholic Church has historically not only abused the people of Ireland and people worldwide, but also, in fact, abused and disrespected the name of God, not using him as a guiding figure, but as an excuse to conduct their own abuses. There are multiple scandals, such as the sexual abuse of children by multiple priests on a worldwide scale. Those who have been trusted to be vessels of the Lord and help guide the young into a life of Christianity have taken advantage of the innocence of those who wish to turn to God for their own guidance. In their actions, they have inflicted an immeasurable amount of trauma towards these children, causing suffering for the rest of their lives. In 2021, a report from the Associated Press stated that 330,000 people were victims of sexual abuse within France's Catholic Church over the past 70 years, 216,000 being minors. Many people have turned away from the Catholic Church because of this, and for this, I do not blame them. The abuses that they have inflicted has not only caused resentment toward Christianity, but also God. By using God, they have acted upon their most assorted desires. This has led them to protest. It is these priests who have undertaken the lifestyle of embodying and enforcing the principles of God, which is to be omnipotent, loving, and caring. They have instead illustrated an image of God being dangerous and forgiving. They operate not as vessels of God, but as wolves in sheep's clothing, preying upon those who are easily impressionable and defenseless. And for this, they have used their positions and the idea of God as a way to carry out their own twisted manifestation of reality. The Catholic Church, in fact, knew about these abuses, and they tried their best to cover them up, to protect themselves, enforcing the fact that they not act as a force for good. The Magdalene Lotteries reinforce as to why the Catholic Church is not a force for good. The idea that nuns and priests alike judge women, many whom have fell the victim to rape, sexual assault and incest, and a whole multitude of crimes, do not conform to the ideal world they set the standard for, is blasphemous. And they have once again used God to create their own agenda on how reality should operate. The sheer amounts of abuse and violence that took place in these institutions goes against everything the name of God stands for. And the Church has proven yet again that they do not act on God for their reasoning, but their own selfishness, arrogance, and pride. They have fallen victim to their deepest desires and seen themselves as their own purveyors of justice as an excuse to inflict violence among women. This is something that will haunt the Catholic Church's legacy forever. They have once again failed the people, God, and themselves by doing these acts. If the Catholic Church was a true force for good in the world, these heinous crimes would have never seen the light of day, let alone be attempted to be covered up by the Church. As I draw near to the end of my time, I'd like to read Isaiah 41:10. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. The Catholic Church has historically failed to represent any of the principles in the following passage. Instead, they have presented themselves as anti-God with their scandals and cover-ups, not in the name of protecting God, but themselves and their horrific abuses. They have forever stained the legacy of Catholicism and what it means to have faith in God. They have not projected God's righteous right hand. Instead, they have become their own personification of righteousness, using their own right hand as a suppressant. There have been multiple reimbursements, apologies, and promises of improvement to the Catholic community in hopes of forgiveness for these acts. Pope Francis, in hopes of painting the Catholic Church in a better light, has in fact denounced laws on homosexuality, spoke out against these abuses, and offered help to any victim that was abused by the Church over the years. Despite these efforts, however, the damage is done, and it has been done for hundreds of years, and your guilt does not make you pure. Finally, my advice to anyone in the audience who find themselves questioning their faith in God, or their faith in general, my word of advice is that God is always with you. Through God-given eyes, you see the reality around you, and you see the abuses that have been carried out under the name of God by the Catholic Church. So how can any institution that abuses fellow human beings, attempts to cover up these abuses, and misrepresent the name of God in any way call themselves a force for good? God is within your mind, your body, and your soul. Learning this has benefited my life personally, and I aim to carry out these principles every day. I didn't find God through the Catholic Church, as I was turned away from them when learning more about their scandals. I found it through looking into myself, discovering my relationship with God, and essentially remembering my name. And thus, these are my reasonings as to why I think the Catholic Church has disgraced the true meaning of God and His Word, and have ultimately failed to be a force for good in the world we live in today, because they have represented God as villainous when that is far from the truth. Thank you for listening, and thank you to the proposition and the opposition.
Thank you very much to Jamie for that. That marks the end of our speeches. There will now be a brief 5-minute break in which you can go to the toilet, get some water, whatever. And when we come back, we'll have the chairs set on stage for the Q&A. So yeah.